Esther's actually a very hard book, and the church has wrestled deeply with the role, should Esther be in the canon? I mean, they didn't settle that for hundreds of years after Jesus was born, really. And then the version of Esther that the church used until the time of the Reformation was the longer version of Esther, the Greek version of Esther, which includes God and prayer and fills in all the blanks that are present in the Hebrew version that we have now in our Protestant Bibles. So it is a question, how do you preach the book of Esther when God is not mentioned, the covenant is not mentioned, prayer is not mentioned, Israel, the promises of God, all these things are not mentioned. But it is a challenge in one way, but in another way, I would argue that it's a very relevant book for today because it's about living in a foreign empire, right? And as the church, certainly in a Canadian context, we live in a very post-Christian culture. How do you negotiate as a marginalized group under a foreign empire? And the Jews in the time in Persia were under the rule of Xerxes, who was, I think, irresponsible, intemperate guy, and made impulsive decisions and put God's people at risk. And similarly today, what about the Christians worldwide in a global context who live in a culture that is anti-faith and they are under persecution? So it models how to be faithful in that kind of context. So even though God is not explicitly named in the book of Esther, God is everywhere, in the surprises, in the chance meetings, in the reversals. And I think early on, people used typology to bring these analogies from the Old to New Testament. Xerxes is God. And I'm thinking, I'm not happy doing that because I think Xerxes is not like God to me. All his decisions are like he's. Anyway, I don't go with that analogy at all, but I think reading the book of Esther in its ancient context, and also within the story of God, brings it in. It's an unfinished story. At the end of chapter 10, Mordecai is second in command. Things are going well. But it's under Persian rule, and Xerxes is not a guy you can trust. So God's people are still at risk. So it's looking forward to something more permanent. So arguably, you see the story of God. It's a very important piece in the story of God, part of the story, because there's going to be a genocide. God's people everywhere in the Persian Empire, that included the Holy Land, were going to be killed. And so Esther risks her life, and is able to broker deliverance for God's people. So it is part of the story of God, a very significant episode in the salvation of God's people, even though God is not explicitly mentioned.